Yaul Perez-Stable Husni, comparative literature, creative minor. He was talking on the history of the prose poem.
Thank you. And before beginning, my faculty result here, first of all, supervisor and the dorms and my fellow arts and literature cohort helping me out. So I promise not to say this when I came up here, since it's written on the screen. My name is Yaul, and title of my project is For the History of the Prose Poem. In the dedicatory letter of his collection, The Deep Waves of Prose, Charles Baudelaire, French poet writing in the middle of the 19th century, and the first major practitioner of the prose poem, attempts a definition of the form. Who among us has not dreamt in its ambitious days of the miracle of a poetic prose, musical, without rhythm or rhyme, flexible, yet rugged enough to adapt itself to the lyrical movements of the soul, to the undulations of reverie, the somersaults of consciousness. This offers a useful starting point for thinking about the definitional questions raised with the term prose poem. First, Baudelaire presents the prose poem as a hybrid form, one that produces certain poetic effects without recourse to the resources of verse. That said, both prose and poetry refer to a wide array of texts. The prose poem's hybridity, then, depends on an act of selection, on foregrounding certain aspects of each. In doing so, the prose poem becomes a space in which these differences can be challenged and reconfigured. Second, Baudelaire presents the prose poem as capable of capturing the experience of consciousness in modern urban life, precisely because of its flexibility, because it is not bound to meter or to traditional ideas of lyric and pastoral. In my research, I proceeded with these two concerns in mind. That is, to what extent do individual prose poems attempt to actively define themselves in relation to other discourses, and then what ends does this hybridity serve? Today I'm going to speak about two prose poems, The System by John Ashbery, who's an American poet writing in the middle of began writing in the middle of the 20th century, from his collection of 3 poems, and Sunday, by Lisa Robertson, who's a contemporary Canadian poet, from her collection The Weather. I want to speak specifically to how the formal question of hybridity lends itself to thematic concerns. For Ashbery, the relationship between the fragment and the whole. For Robertson, how our experience of textual and domestic space can interrelate. Given the prose poem's relatively short history, multiple critics have attempted to determine its forerunners, and these include the Reverie, the prose translation of verse, the Romantic Fragment, among others. Jonathan Monroe, who studied poverty of objects, was among the first on the prose poem, points to the fragments of Friedrich Schlegel as precursors to Baudelaire's prose poems because of the former's interest in the fusion of genres and its presentation in a series. The tension Monroe takes to be central to Schlegel seems applicable to Ashbery as well. Quoting Schlegel, Monroe writes, "It's equally fatal to the mind to have a system and to have none. We'll simply have to decide to combine the two." In the first 10 pages of The System, Ashbery makes reference to the philosophy of Hegel, or to concepts we associate with it, first by way of vocabulary. The system, inner necessity, conscience eternally mobilized against itself, and history. Indeed, the speaker presents himself as the observer of a sequence of obscure phenomena, reminiscent of Hegel and phenomenology, who traces the progression of consciousness as it's by watching it unfold on its own. Moreover, from the 5th to the 8th paragraph, in one of the poem's more narrative sections, Ashbery progresses by way of quasi-dialectic. He writes, "Not an atom that did not feel obscurely compelled to set out in search of a mate, not a living creature, no insect or rodent that didn't feel the obscure twitchings of dormant love, that didn't ache to join in the universal turmoil and hullabaloo that fell over the earth, roiling the clear waters of the reflective intellect, getting into all kinds of messes that could have been avoided if only, as Pascal says, we had the sense to stay in our room." The poem names multiple desiring subjects, creatures, rodents, insects, atoms, but these differences are made secondary to desire. Common ground is established, however, this common ground is not determined by a shared beloved, but by the experience of desiring. The individual does not recognize the collective, and therein lies its connection to the collective. Ashbery's reference to Pascal's 136 Prose illuminates the nature of this desire. Pascal describes diversions, one of his examples is hunting, as that which distracts humans from their mortality. The hunt becomes self-defeating because the hunt itself, and not the hunted object, affects this diversion. As a consequence, the realization of the objective, say capturing the hare, destroys the conditions for the hunt, turning humans' thoughts back to mortality, and so the need for the hunt's repetition. There exists then a tension between how each desiring subject views himself and how he views others. What I think is important here is that Ashbery resolves this tension not by argumentation, but through the figure of a tree. That's an extended quote, but through the figure of a tree, an organism that reveals the necessity of conserving each particle as preciously as the idea of the whole. The poem does not progress by way of an inner necessity. To the contrary, it depends on certain images near the tree, and later the river, to negotiate the contradictions it presents. This sequence culminates with the end of history, a, quote, magic present that drew everything, the old and the new, along in the net of its infectious charm. But the poem can express this magic present, which contains all that came before, only in terms of potentiality, which is to say, only in terms of a new sequence. The moment in which we apprehend the whole is also the moment at which we recognize its incompleteness. Hence the poem's opening sentence, the system was breaking down. The end point, which was supposed to serve as a vantage point from which the speaker could retrace the progression, becomes itself part of the progression. The poem does not fuse genres, but stages the inability to do so, the inability to form a system. And because its potentially infinite sequence renders each stage of the development equal to all the others, because none is closer to the ending than any of the others, the poem enacts at a structural level an inversion of Pascal's 136 Prose. The absence of an endpoint does not divert one from the present, but call attention to the experience of the present. Brevity has been an important criterion for critics interested in drawing a boundary between the prose poem and other types of prose. At 40 pages, the system explodes this model, and yet indirectly touches on the motives for emphasizing brevity by way of its focus on the present. The second poet I will discuss is Lisa Robertson, whose collection The Weather is made up of both verse and blocks of justified text. Blocks of justified text sounds like a description of the prose poem's appearance on the page, but I wonder if Robertson would be opposed to the term prose poem entirely. In an interview from 2010, she says the caesura, which is a pause near the middle of a metrical line, though it can also mean an interruption. Its turn is what distinguishes poetry from prose, not the customs of distribution of words on the page. In the time of the caesura, a thinking gathers, dissolves, moves. The immaterial work of the caesura is to subvert the fixing of language by protocols and institutions, to renew a historicity within the subject. Whereas in the case of Ashbery, it appeared promising to trace the presence of other discourses, namely the philosophical, as a means of accounting for the poem's status in prose, Robertson's poem Sunday does not identify prose discourse. Indeed, the poem focuses its attention at the level of the name, a component of both prose and poetry. She writes, "Here are farms and manors and mines and woods and forests and houses and streets. Here are hill and dell. Here are hill, dell, water, meadows, woods, line upon line, twist and rough. Here are new enclosures, the chalk and the sand." A useful way of tracking the poem's relationship to the name is by tracking the changing use of the word there. At first, there functions as a spatial other of here. Here are houses too, here and there. What was a plurality of houses, the poem then turns. Here and there house. What was a plurality of houses is now a single house. Yet the plurality of spaces, here and there, remains. Any point can be a here, and so the delimitation of a larger here depends on the intention of the speaker. There can be found inside here. Towards the end of the poem, there evolves into a descriptive there, reconciled with here. There has been rain here. This descriptive there asserts the fact of existence, the speaker's capacity to recognize objects, but it says nothing particular about them. In an essay titled The Weather, a report on sincerity, Robertson argues that the individuation of clouds by their type, cirrus, cumulus, stratus, allowed observers to trace the temporal development of a specific cloud that could not be cognized by the typology. The asymmetry between the name stasis and the optic's dynamism can come into view only if one recognizes the unity of sensations made possible by the name. The generality of the name does not absorb the particulars, but calls attention to particulars it cannot convey. Similarly, the poem repeats here, expanding or transforming here to include multiple objects and actions. Because the stream of names charts the development of here, Robertson makes the names of particulars function in relation to here, much in the same way that the actual sensory data functions in relation to the name, and in doing so, makes the observer-thing relationship analogous to the reader-text relationship. Prose is central to Robertson because it is elemental and unstaged. Then, what it generates or reveals dense powers for relatedness, the basic principle of poetry in fact emerges within prose. Robertson conceives of reading, of inhabitation, and of dialogue as exchanges that reject fixed identity, each exchange producing its own rhythm. Robertson, following French linguists Émile Benveniste and Henri Descheny, redefines rhythm not as meter or the alternation of beats, but as a particular manner of flowing. Prose poetry becomes an ideal form for exposing the similarity between poetry and space, because just as prose poetry insists on the existence of the poetic outside of verse, so too does Robertson insist on poetic rhythm outside of language. So in conclusion, the system is central to both Ashbery and Robertson. Ashbery stages the inability to form a complete system such that a part cannot be defined in relation to the whole. In his case, to define in terms of the relational is not defined in terms of function within a sequence. The terms Robertson works for in Sunday, here and there, encompass the totality of space as abstraction, but they lose their independence once they are employed to designate specific locations. The problem that emerges is that the alternative to the relational is fixity. So in emphasizing the content of here without providing its reference, Robertson aligns his content not with location, but with the speaker's perceptual field. The value of here depends on the interactions it makes possible. When here refers to a perceptual field, it overcomes its interdependence with there, because a there cannot enter the perceptual field without becoming an extension of here. Robertson imagines a socio-participatory system, one in which the relational no longer describes the indexable terms, but rather the interactions taking place, and so one in which the relational no longer fixes meaning.
I think I was very interested in what you had to say about here and there. That was very insightful. So what we would say is that they're both didactic words that are anchored to the context. You can't understand it from a dictionary. But one of them there has that distinction you talked about, and here doesn't have it. Do you have any thoughts about that? So you pointed out in that last quote you had that it's there that's meaningless, and here is still this spatial use. We don't have that.
Not right.
I don't understand the question.
So, you brought up here and there as kind of a dual pair, and indeed they're considered in linguistics as a dual pair of spatial dictics, one defined by where the speaker